Picture looking at a mummy with individual eyelashes still visible after 4,000 years, hair that retains its original color, skin so well preserved you can still see the texture, clothing so intact you can count the individual threads. But here's what makes it impossible. No one embalmed this person. No priests performed elaborate rituals. No one spent 70 days carefully removing organs, applying natron, wrapping the body in linen. There were no ceremonies, no spells written on tomb walls, no preparation at all. This person was simply buried in the sand. And the desert did something that the ancient Egyptians spent weeks and enormous resources trying to achieve. It preserved them perfectly, completely by accident. When Chinese archaeologists first showed these mummies to Western experts in the 1980s, one researcher said the bodies looked as if they'd been buried yesterday, but they were 3,000 years old. Some were even older, nearly twice as old as King Tut. The preservation is so extraordinary that when you look at some of these faces, you can see what mood they were in when they died. Peaceful, surprised, troubled, their final expressions frozen in time, not distorted by decay, not obscured by the passage of millennia. Just there, present, as if the person had fallen asleep yesterday and might wake at any moment. This isn't just remarkable, it's unprecedented. Nowhere else on Earth has natural preservation worked quite this well. Not in the peat bogs of northern Europe, though those have yielded their own wonders. Not in the high Andes, where altitude and cold have preserved some ancient remains. Not even in the frozen reaches of the Arctic. The Taklamakan Desert has created something unique. A gallery of perfectly preserved humanity, spanning thousands of years. How is this possible? How does a desert accomplish what even the most skilled embalmers could barely achieve? The answer lies in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. A desert with a name that translates to "you go in, you don't come out." The Sea of Death, the place of no return. The Taklamakan Desert in western China. If you're enjoying this journey through the mysteries of the Silk Road, hit that like button and subscribe. There's so much more to discover about the people who vanished into the sands and emerged perfectly preserved thousands of years later. This desert is massive, nearly the size of Finland, and it experiences some of the most extreme temperature swings on the planet. In winter, it can drop to negative 40 degrees Celsius. In summer, it can soar to positive 40. That's an 80-degree range. But temperature alone doesn't explain the preservation. It's the combination of factors working together in perfect, terrible harmony. The extreme aridity. We're talking about one of the driest places on Earth. Some areas receive less than 10 millimeters of rainfall per year. That's barely measurable. It's a trace. In practical terms, it rains almost never. The soil composition matters too. Rich with salt and alkaline minerals. These chemicals actively inhibit bacterial growth. They pull moisture from organic material. They create an environment where the microorganisms that normally break down dead tissue simply can't function. And then there's the temperature cycle. Those bitterly cold winters, plunging to negative 40 degrees Celsius, freeze bodies solid almost immediately after burial. And when I say immediately, I mean within hours if burial happened in winter. The cold halts all biological processes, freezes moisture in place, creates what's essentially a time lock. Then, as temperatures rise in summer, the dry air continues the work, pulling moisture from tissues faster than bacteria could ever grow, desiccating, mummifying, transforming flesh into something stable, permanent. preserved. The Egyptians understood intuitively that moisture was the enemy of preservation. That's why their elaborate mummification process focused obsessively on drying the body completely. They removed organs that would decay quickly, treated the body with natron salts, wrapped it in resin-soaked linen. The entire process could take 70 days. Teams of specialized priests performing sacred rituals. Enormous expense. Complex knowledge passed down through generations. Nature did it in hours, maybe days, completely by accident, with no intention, no ritual, no sacred purpose. Just physics and chemistry working in an environment so extreme that it created perfect preservation as an unintended side effect. The bodies in the Taklamakan were essentially freeze-dried where they lay. The extreme cold of winter would have frozen them solid almost immediately after burial. Then, as temperatures rose, the dry air and saline soil wicked moisture away before decomposition could truly take hold. By the time the first bacteria could have begun breaking down tissue, there was nothing left for them to work with. The bodies were already mummified, and unlike Egyptian mummies, which were often darkened and hardened by the preservation process, these bodies retained a startling naturalness. Hair that looks like it could still blow in the wind. Faces that seem like they might open their eyes. Eyelashes so delicate and perfect that archaeologists can study them under microscopes. One mummy, discovered in the 90s, was so well preserved that researchers nicknamed her after a famous Hollywood actress, the Beauty of Xiaohe. Her eyelashes were described as lush, still perfectly arranged after nearly 4,000 years. Another mummy, found decades earlier, had an elaborate braided hairstyle that remained completely intact. You can see exactly how she wore her hair the day she died. 1,800 years before the Common Era. This isn't just academic curiosity. This is something profound. These people aren't distant artifacts. They're almost alive, present in a way that stone statues or pottery fragments can never be. And there are hundreds of them. Over 200 mummies discovered across the Tarim Basin, the depression that contains the Taklamakan Desert, dating from 2100 BCE all the way to 200 CE. More than 2,000 years of continuous burial in the sands, each one a time capsule, each one preserved by nothing more than the harshest environment on Earth. Think about that for a moment. Truly consider the paradox. The same conditions that would kill a living person within days created perfect preservation for the dead. The desert that gave this place its fearsome name, the place of no return, the Sea of Death, also gave these ancient people a kind of immortality. The environment that destroyed cities and ended civilizations became the gentlest guardian of human memory. It's one of nature's strange ironies. In trying to survive here, ancient peoples faced constant threats: dehydration, temperature extremes, sandstorms that could strip flesh from bone. This was not a forgiving place. It tested everyone who tried to live within its boundaries. But in death, the desert was merciful. It accepted bodies and transformed them into time capsules. It created museum-quality preservation through nothing more than being exactly what it is: harsh, dry, extreme, inhospitable, perfect. But who were they? These people with their perfectly preserved faces and their mysterious burials deep in the desert sands? That question would take decades to answer. And when scientists finally got the answer, it would overturn everything anyone had assumed. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand that these mummies weren't just scattered randomly across empty wasteland. They were buried near cities, near civilization. Because despite its reputation as a place of death, despite its extreme temperatures and brutal aridity, this desert was once home to thriving communities, oasis cities, fed by rivers flowing down from the mountains, trading posts where merchants from China met merchants from Persia, religious centers where Buddhist monks studied alongside Manichaean priests and Nestorian Christians, places where multiple cultures blended into something unique. The greatest of these cities was called Gaochang, and at its height, it was home to 30,000 people in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by one of the most hostile environments humans have ever tried to live in. The ruins of Gaochang still stand today, or rather, they still sit, massive walls slowly being swallowed by advancing sand dunes, buildings collapsing back into the earth, a ghost city that whispers of better days. But 1,400 years ago, Gaochang was anything but dead. It was a Silk Road hub, a multicultural paradise. A city that shouldn't have existed but thrived anyway, against all odds. And the cemeteries surrounding that city contain some of the most perfectly preserved glimpses into ancient life ever discovered. 1,300-year-old dumplings that look fresh enough to eat. Cheese that's 3,600 years old. Clothing that could have been woven yesterday. The desert preserved it all. So when we look at these faces, these bodies, these fragments of daily life frozen in time, we're not looking at ancient history in the usual sense. We're looking through a window, crystal clear, showing us people who lived and died thousands of years ago, but who seem almost present, almost touchable. The impossible preservation of the Taklamakan Desert has given us something extraordinary. Not just mummies, not just artifacts, but a direct connection to a lost world, to cities that thrived and fell, to people who loved and grieved and hoped and feared, to mysteries that still remain unsolved after decades of research. And it all starts with that face, those eyelashes, that hair, preserved against all odds in the sea of death. Imagine trying to build a city in one of the harshest places on Earth. Not just a small outpost, not just a temporary camp, but a real city with 30,000 residents, with massive walls that tower 12 meters high and stretch 12 meters thick, with temples and monasteries, markets and homes, all of it surrounded by desert so unforgiving that travelers gave it names like Place of No Return. It sounds impossible, and yet Gaochang existed for 1,400 years, 14 centuries. That's longer than most European nations have existed in their current form, longer than the United States by nearly 4 times. Through the rise and fall of dynasties, through wars and peace, through cultural shifts and religious changes, Gaochang endured. The city sat on the northern rim of the Taklamakan Desert, in what is now the Xinjiang region of western China. But calling it a Chinese city doesn't quite capture what it was, because Gaochang was something far more interesting than any single culture could create. It was a crossroads, a meeting place, a city where East genuinely met West, in ways that would seem familiar to us today but were extraordinary for their time. The outer walls formed a circuit of over 5 kilometers, built not with stone but with rammed earth, layer after careful layer, each one only 8 to 12 centimeters thick, compressed and dried until they became as hard as concrete. The labor required to build these walls would have been immense. Thousands of workers over years or decades, all in service of protecting this oasis city from the desert and from potential invaders. Inside those walls lived people from everywhere. Han Chinese administrators and merchants, Uyghur traders and craftsmen, Turkish nomads who'd settled into urban life, Sogdians from Central Asia who spoke an Iranian language and controlled much of the Silk Road trade, and others whose exact origins we may never know. They practiced different religions, often in the same neighborhoods. Buddhist monasteries housed 3,000 monks at the city's peak. Manichaean temples, following a religion that blended Christian and Zoroastrian elements, conducted their mysterious rites. Nestorian Christians, whose version of Christianity had been declared heretical by Rome and Constantinople, found refuge here and built their own churches. Later, Islam would arrive and transform the city yet again. This wasn't just tolerance, it was cosmopolitanism, real cultural exchange happening daily in the markets and streets. A Song dynasty envoy who visited in the late 10th century left a report that sounds almost utopian. He wrote that there were no poor people in Gaochang, that when someone lacked food, the entire community would come to help, that people lived remarkably long lives, with many residents reaching over 100 years old. Now, we should take that report with some skepticism. Official envoys often exaggerated the prosperity of places they visited, but even allowing for some embellishment, it suggests Gaochang was thriving, that it had systems of mutual support. That life there, despite the harsh environment, was good. How did they survive? How did 30,000 people live in a place surrounded by sand and extreme temperatures? Water. The answer, as it so often is in desert environments, was water. Rivers flowing down from the Tian Shan Mountains to the north carried snowmelt and rainfall from high elevations. These rivers created a network of oases along the desert's edge, and the people of Gaochang became masters at managing this precious resource. They built elaborate irrigation systems, networks of channels that directed water where it was needed most. Cisterns carved into the earth to store water during abundant seasons. Underground aqueducts, called carrés, that minimized evaporation as water traveled from source to city. These weren't simple ditches. They were sophisticated engineering projects that required planning, maintenance, and communal cooperation. The same ingenuity that built those massive walls also tamed the water enough to support a large population. Water management wasn't just practical, it was survival. Every drop had to be accounted for, directed, used efficiently. The desert taught these lessons harshly to anyone who didn't learn them quickly enough. And then there was trade. Gaochang's location wasn't just survivable, it was strategic. The Silk Road wasn't a single road, but a network of routes connecting east and west. And several of those routes converged near Gaochang. Merchants traveling the northern path around the Taklamakan Desert would stop here. It was a natural waypoint, a place to rest, to resupply, to trade goods and information. Imagine the markets, the sounds. Chinese merchants haggling in Mandarin, Sogdian traders speaking their Iranian language, Turkish nomads, Persian visitors, all conducting business in a lingua franca of commerce that transcended any single tongue. The smell of spices from India, silk from China, leather goods from the steppes, glassware that might have originated in Rome or Persia passed through dozens of hands before arriving here. Persian silver coins have been found in Gaochang tombs. Roman gold coins, too. These tiny metal objects traveled thousands upon thousands of miles to end up here. They're proof of just how interconnected this ancient world actually was. Someone in Gaochang held a coin minted in Rome, felt its weight, used it to purchase something, and then took it to the grave, where it would wait for archaeologists to discover centuries later. The city was called different names by different peoples. The Chinese knew it as Gaochang, but in Sogdian sources, it was referred to as Chinatown, which is fascinating when you think about it. This was a city in Central Asia, surrounded by predominantly West Eurasian peoples, but it was so Chinese in character that Sogdian traders labeled it as such. Inside the city's outer walls was an inner city, and inside that, a palace city where rulers lived and conducted official business. This three-part structure was classic Chinese urban planning. But the people living there, they were from everywhere. The architecture, a blend of styles. The goods in the markets, from places whose names most residents probably couldn't pronounce. Gaochang was largest city in what the Chinese called the Western regions, and during certain periods, particularly under Tang Dynasty rule, it was one of the most important cities in all of Central Asia. But here's what makes it even more remarkable. This wasn't just a wealthy city for elites. The mummies buried in the cemeteries surrounding Gaochang tell us that ordinary people lived here too. Farmers, craftspeople, workers, people whose clothing had been mended multiple times, people who struggled with health problems and pollution and the daily challenges of survival. They weren't all rich. They weren't all educated, but they were part of something larger than themselves. A civilization that somehow thrived in a place that should have been uninhabitable. Think about the psychological resilience required. Every single day, residents would have been aware of the desert surrounding them. The heat in summer could reach well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. In winter, temperatures would plunge below freezing. The temperature swings alone would have been exhausting. And always, there was the awareness, the knowledge that water sources might fail, that trade routes might shift, that invaders might come, that the desert, patient and relentless, was always waiting. Yet they stayed. Generation after generation chose to remain, to build, to raise families in this impossible place. They created art that has survived in fragments, wrote poetry that we can still read in documents preserved by the dry air, practiced their various faiths with devotion, and buried their dead with care and ceremony, confident that this harsh land would be their home for as long as they could make it so. The desert preserved some of that care. The mummies from Gaochang's cemeteries were buried with grave goods, food for the journey to the afterlife, favorite possessions, sometimes even pets. These weren't just bodies dumped in the sand. These were loved ones, mourned and honored. Gaochang stood for 1,400 years. That's not luck. That's human determination, human ingenuity, human cooperation across cultural and linguistic and religious boundaries. It's easy to think of ancient peoples as somehow less capable than us, less sophisticated. But when you look at what they accomplished in places like Gaochang, that assumption falls apart. They were doing things we would find incredibly difficult even with modern technology. Building a city in the desert, making it thrive, keeping it alive for over a millennium, all while maintaining enough openness to allow different cultures to coexist and influence each other. In many ways, Gaochang was ahead of its time. Or perhaps it was of its time, and we've just forgotten how cosmopolitan the ancient world could actually be. But of course, nothing lasts forever. And Gaochang's story contains dramatic turning points, moments when individual choices or historical forces changed everything, moments that would echo down through the centuries. One of those moments involved a Buddhist monk with an iron will and a king who wanted to keep him. And their confrontation would become the stuff of legend. In the year 630, a Buddhist monk arrived at the gates of Gaochang. His name was Xuanzang, and he was already exhausted from months of dangerous travel. But his journey was just beginning. He was headed to India, to the birthplace of Buddhism, to find authentic Buddhist scriptures that could resolve theological disputes back in China. The journey itself was illegal. Xuanzang had left Tang Dynasty territory without official permission. In that era, unauthorized departure was a serious crime. The borders were controlled. Travel to foreign lands required imperial approval. Xuanzang had requested permission and been denied, so he'd gone anyway, slipping past frontier guards in the dead of night, risking execution if caught. Why take such a risk? Because Xuanzang believed Chinese Buddhism had strayed from authentic teachings. Different schools interpreted the same texts in contradictory ways. Debates raged over fundamental questions. What is the nature of consciousness? Can enlightenment be achieved gradually, or must it come in a sudden flash? Which sutras are most authoritative? These weren't abstract philosophical puzzles. They were questions that shaped how millions of people understood their spiritual practice. The only solution was to go to the source, to travel to India, the birthplace of Buddhism, to study with Indian masters who maintained unbroken lineages of teaching stretching back centuries, to bring back original scriptures written in Sanskrit that could settle these disputes definitively. It was an audacious plan, a journey of thousands of miles through some of the most dangerous terrain in the world, and he was doing it alone. So he'd crossed the Gobi Desert, nearly died of thirst, survived attacks by bandits, endured freezing mountain passes, all to reach the holy sites where the Buddha had taught over 1,000 years earlier. And now he'd arrived in Gaochang, this oasis city on the edge of the Taklamakan, a place to rest, to resupply, and then to continue west. What happened next would become one of the most famous stories in Chinese history. And centuries later, it would inspire one of China's greatest novels, featuring a character you might know, the Monkey King. But that comes later. First, there was the confrontation. King Chu Wintai ruled Gaochang at the time, and he was a devoted Buddhist. When word reached him that a Chinese monk of extraordinary learning had arrived in his city, he insisted on meeting this Xuanzang. The meeting was arranged quickly. The king was eager, and when they met, the king was amazed. This wasn't just some ordinary traveler. This was a scholar of remarkable depth, a man who could discuss the deepest points of Buddhist philosophy with clarity and precision, who could debate sutras and clarify doctrine, who had memorized vast quantities of text and could explain complex ideas in ways that made them accessible. The king, himself well-educated in Buddhist thought, recognized immediately that he was in the presence of someone exceptional. The king made Xuanzang an offer, a generous offer. Stay in Gaochang, become the chief priest, lead the Buddhist community of 3,000 monks. The king would provide everything he needed: honor, wealth, a temple of his own, safety, comfort, respect, everything a monk could want. It wasn't just a position. It was an opportunity to shape the spiritual life of an entire city, except the freedom to continue his journey. Xuanzang politely declined. He explained that he'd already come so far, that his mission was sacred, that he had to reach India, no matter how long it took or how dangerous the path ahead might be. The king asked again, more insistently this time. Think of what you could accomplish here, he said. Think of how many people you could teach. Why risk your life crossing deserts and mountains when you could do so much good right here? Again, Xuanzang refused. His mind was set. His purpose was clear. That's when the king's tone changed. This wasn't a request anymore. It was a command. You will stay, the king said. I'm not giving you a choice. And Xuanzang, this monk who'd already traveled through some of the most dangerous terrain in the world, who'd risked execution by illegally leaving Tang Dynasty territory, who'd crossed deserts where men died from thirst and cold, made a decision that must have stunned everyone present. He began a hunger strike, not as a theatrical gesture, not as a negotiating tactic, as a matter of principle. He would not be forced. He would not abandon his mission. And if that meant dying right here in Gaochang, so be it. Think about the psychology of that moment. Here's a king, a man with absolute power over his kingdom. Who could have Xuanzang imprisoned? Who could use force? Who held every practical advantage? And here's a monk who owned nothing, who had no army, no wealth, no leverage except his own willingness to die for his beliefs. For several days, Xuanzang refused all food. The king tried persuasion. He sent advisors. He promised even greater honors. But the monk would not eat, would not compromise. And eventually, remarkably, the king backed down, not out of weakness, but out of respect. He recognized that he was dealing with someone whose will could not be broken, whose spiritual purpose was stronger than any physical coercion. And perhaps King Kui Wentai understood, on some level, that forcing such a man to stay would bring no real benefit. You can imprison a body, but you can't imprison devotion. So the king relented. But he didn't just let Xuanzang go. Instead, he became the monk's most generous supporter. The king gave Xuanzang 25 companions for the journey, 30 horses to carry supplies, servants to help with practical matters, tribute gifts to present to the kingdoms along the way, and, perhaps most valuably, letters, written introductions to the rulers of 24 kingdoms that lay on the route to India, each letter vouching for Xuanzang, asking those rulers to provide safe passage and assistance, from opponent to patron in a matter of days. Because the king had recognized something in this monk, a quality that demanded respect rather than coercion. Xuanzang continued his journey. He spent years in India, studying at the great Buddhist monasteries, Nalanda, Bodh Gaya, the places where Buddhism had been born and refined over centuries. He collected scriptures, debated with scholars, learned Sanskrit properly, studied with the greatest masters of his time. The journey would take him 17 years in total. 17 years of hardship and discovery and spiritual growth. 17 years of becoming someone different from the young monk who'd slipped past Tang border guards in the night. When he finally returned to China in 6045, he brought with him over 600 Buddhist texts, scriptures that had never been seen in China before. Some written on palm leaves, others on birch bark, all precious, all rare. He spent the rest of his life translating them, creating definitive Chinese versions of fundamental Buddhist works. His translations became the standard. His commentaries shaped how generations of Chinese Buddhists understood their faith. The debates that had driven him to make this illegal journey were resolved, not by argument, but by bringing back the original sources. The Tang Emperor, the same emperor who'd initially denied Xuanzang permission to leave, welcomed him back as a hero. The illegal journey had become a triumph. The monk who defied imperial authority was now celebrated as one of China's greatest scholars. But Xuanzang also brought back something else. Stories, tales of his travels, the dangers he'd faced, the wonders he'd seen, the kingdoms he'd visited, and those stories spread. They were told and retold, embellished and expanded, until eventually they became legend. By the 16th century, those legends had been woven into one of the 4 great classical novels of Chinese literature, Journey to the West. In this novelized version, Xuanzang isn't traveling alone. He's accompanied by fantastical companions, including a magical monkey, the Monkey King, Sun Wukong. That story has been adapted countless times in books, in films, in television shows, and video games. The Monkey King has become a global cultural icon. Most people who know the character have no idea he comes from a story based on a real person's real journey. A journey that passed through Gaochang in the year 631. So when we look at the ruins of Gaochang today, we're looking at a place that's connected to one of the world's most enduring stories. A place where a confrontation between temporal power and spiritual mission became the seed of legend. But there's something poignant about this too, because 10 years after Xuanzang passed through Gaochang, King Chu Wentai would face his own moment of crisis. And this time, there would be no negotiation, no compromise, only fear. And that fear would literally kill him. 10 years passed. King Kui Wentai ruled Gaochang with confidence. His city prospered. Trade flowed through the Silk Road routes. The Buddhist community flourished. Everything seemed secure. But the king made a strategic mistake, a miscalculation that would prove fatal in the most literal sense. He formed an alliance with the Western Turks. Now, alliances weren't unusual. Every ruler in Central Asia had to navigate complex relationships with neighboring powers. The problem was what the king did next. He began blocking Silk Road trade routes, demanding excessive tribute from merchants, interfering with commerce that the Tang dynasty considered vital to its interests. This was dangerous because the Tang dynasty under Emperor Taizong was at the peak of its power. It had reunified China after centuries of division. It commanded enormous resources, and it had no tolerance for disruptions to trade. The emperor sent warnings. The king ignored them. Perhaps he thought Gaochang's distance provided protection. Perhaps he believed the Western Turks would defend him if necessary. Or perhaps he simply didn't take the threat seriously. Because here's what King Kui Wentai believed. He believed that no army could march through the desert. Not a large army, anyway. The logistics would be impossible. The distance was too great, the terrain too harsh, the water sources too scarce. Any force large enough to threaten Gaochang would die in the wasteland long before reaching the city walls. It was a reasonable calculation. Historically, desert had been Gaochang's greatest protection. The same extreme environment that preserved mummies so perfectly also destroyed invading armies. The city had survived for over 700 years, partly because attacking it was so difficult. So when Emperor Taizong dispatched General Hu Junji with an army in 640, King Chu Wentai wasn't particularly concerned. Let them try, he must have thought. The desert will stop them. It always does. But General Ho was brilliant. He understood logistics in ways that defied conventional wisdom. He organized supply lines with mathematical precision, arranged for water caches at strategic points along the route, likely sending advance teams to establish these reserves, timed the march to avoid the worst summer heat, moving during cooler seasons, calculated exactly how much water and food each soldier would need per day, and how much pack animals could carry. He broke the journey into manageable stages, rest periods calculated, grazing opportunities for horses mapped, every detail planned. This wasn't just military courage, it was engineering, problem solving on an enormous scale. The army crossed 7,000 li of desert, that's roughly 3,000 kilometers, through some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. And they didn't just survive. They arrived at Gaochang with their fighting strength intact, ready to siege the city if necessary. Imagine being King Q Wentai. You've spent months confident that geography protects you, that the desert is an impenetrable barrier. And then, in the fall of 640, scouts come rushing to your palace with impossible news. There's an army outside the city, a Tang army. They crossed the desert. They're here, right now. The king couldn't believe it, but he sent people to verify, and they confirmed it. Hu Junji's forces had done what everyone said couldn't be done, and King Qiu Wentai, confronted with the collapse of everything he'd assumed, with the realization that he'd fatally miscalculated, with the knowledge that his alliance had failed and his city was about to fall, suffered what historical records describe as death from anxiety. He had a heart attack or a stroke, something fatal brought on by sudden, overwhelming stress. The shock of being proven so completely wrong killed him before the battle even began. Think about the irony. He'd faced down Xianzhang a decade earlier and won that confrontation through force of will. But now, facing a different kind of pressure, his own psychology became his enemy. The fear, the stress, the psychological collapse was more lethal than any weapon. His son, Hua Zhisheng, inherited a terrible situation. An army at the gates, his father dead from shock, no real options for defense. So he did the only thing that made sense. He surrendered. The city that had stood for over 700 years fell without a battle, without a siege, without bloodshed. Just a door opening and a young king offering submission. Gaochang became a prefecture of the Tang dynasty. It was renamed. It was reorganized. But for a time, it continued to function. The residents stayed. Trade continued. The city's international character remained, now under Chinese administration. The Tang would rule here for over 2 centuries. They brought more Chinese settlers. They built new temples and administrative buildings. They strengthened the city's role in the Silk Road network. Chinese culture became even more dominant. Buddhist monasteries expanded. In some ways, Gaochang became even more important under Tang rule than it had been as an independent kingdom. The city became a model of Tang administration in the Western territories. Officials were appointed from the imperial capital. Taxes flowed back to Chang'an. Soldiers garrisoned the walls. It was no longer just a Silk Road trading post. It was a symbol of Tang reach and power. But something fundamental had changed. The city's autonomy was gone. Its fate was now tied to distant imperial politics, to decisions made thousands of miles away. Local circumstances mattered less than the empire's strategic priorities. And when the Tang dynasty eventually weakened in later centuries, when their grip on these western territories loosened, Gaochang's vulnerability would become clear. The king who died of fear never saw any of that. He died at the moment of crisis, killed by his own miscalculation. There's something almost tragic about it. He wasn't a terrible king. By most accounts, he ruled fairly. His support of Xuanzang showed wisdom and flexibility. His city prospered under his leadership, but he misjudged the capabilities of his enemies. He underestimated what determined men with good planning could accomplish. And when reality shattered his assumptions, his body couldn't handle the shock. It's a reminder that psychological resilience matters. That stress can kill as surely as a blade, that sometimes the most dangerous battles are the ones fought in our own minds. The ruins of Gaochang don't remember King Qiu Wentai specifically. There's no statue, no monument, just the slowly crumbling walls he once defended. But his story remains, passed down through historical records, a cautionary tale about hubris and miscalculation and the deadly power of fear. And while the city continued for centuries after his death, that moment marked the end of Gaochang as an independent power. From 640 onward, it would always be subject to someone else's authority. its destiny controlled from elsewhere. But empires rise and fall. Cities change hands, and through it all, the desert continued its patient work, preserving, burying, keeping its secrets in the sand. For centuries after that Tang conquest, Gaochang continued to evolve. The city remained important through the Uyghur kingdom of Guochu, which ruled from the mid-9th century onward. These Uyghur rulers maintained the city's multicultural character. Buddhist monasteries continued to flourish alongside temples dedicated to other faiths. Merchants still stopped here on their journeys across the Silk Road. Life went on. When the Mongols arrived in the 13th century, Gaochang submitted to their authority. Under Mongol protection, trade actually expanded. The vast Pax Mongolica connected east and west in ways never seen before. Goods and ideas flowed more freely than ever. For a time, the city prospered under this new order. But nothing lasts forever. In the 14th century, as Mongol power fragmented and competing khanates warred with each other, the Silk Road trade that sustained Gaochang began to collapse. Warfare made travel dangerous. Routes shifted south or were abandoned entirely. And then came the violence that would end the city for good. Around 1400 CE, Gaochang was finally abandoned. The reasons were complex. Warfare, trade disruption, perhaps environmental factors as water sources became less reliable. Whatever the combination, the result was the same. After 1400 years of continuous occupation, the people left. The buildings stood empty, and the desert began its patient work of reclamation. For centuries, the ruins sat forgotten. Local people knew they were there, but didn't fully understand their significance. Then, in the early 20th century, Western archaeologists and explorers began arriving. German expeditions in particular documented what remained and removed many artifacts and manuscripts. Some saw this as preservation, others saw it as plunder. Either way, the story of Gaochang was finally beginning to be told to the wider world. But those early explorers were looking at the ruins, at what remained of the living city. What they didn't fully appreciate yet was what the desert had preserved in the cemeteries surrounding those ruins. The bodies buried in the sand. The people who had lived and died here over thousands of years. The mummies that would eventually reveal secrets nobody had imagined. While Gaochang stood and fell and stood again under different rulers, something else was happening in the desert surrounding it. Something quiet. Something that would remain hidden for centuries. People were being buried, and the desert was preserving them. Not just a few people, hundreds of them, in cemeteries scattered across the Tarim Basin, each burial a time capsule, each body a story waiting to be discovered. The closest cemetery to Gaochang is called Astana. It's located just 6 kilometers from the ruins of the city, close enough that funeral processions would have been a regular sight, making their way from the city gates to the burial grounds. And it served as the public burial ground for Gaochang's residents during some of the city's most prosperous centuries. From 273 CE to 77-8 CE, 500 years of burials, over 1,000 tombs, layer upon layer of generations, each one leaving their mark in the sand. Since excavations began in 1959, archaeologists have opened 456 of these tombs, and they've found over 10,000 artifacts. Not just bones and pottery, but documents written on paper and silk, contracts, legal agreements, personal letters that read like they could have been written yesterday, paintings showing daily scenes, markets, officials, ordinary moments frozen in pigment. Food that still retained its shape after more than 1,000 years. Clothing that could be examined thread by thread, revealing weaving techniques and repair methods. Personal possessions that tell us about daily life in ways that historical records never could. The small things, the intimate details, the reality of existence beyond official chronicles. Tax documents survived, letters between family members, shopping lists, account books, the mundane bureaucracy of life that usually disappears within years, preserved for over 1,000. These weren't just graves. They were archives, libraries of ordinary life. These weren't elite burials. These were ordinary residents of Gaochang, merchants and farmers, craftspeople and laborers, people who wore mended clothing, who owned modest possessions. And the preservation was so extraordinary that archaeologists could see details of their lives that would normally vanish within decades. The democracy of preservation, rich and poor alike, survived in the sand. But the Astana Cemetery, remarkable as it is, wasn't the oldest. And it wasn't the most mysterious. About 170 miles to the west, deeper into the desert, lies another burial site, Shaohe Cemetery, the Small River Cemetery. And this place is different, older, stranger, more enigmatic in almost every way. Shaohe dates from the Bronze Age. Between 1980 BCE and 1450 BCE, these people lived and died over 3,000 years ago, and they were buried in ways that raise questions we still can't answer. The cemetery contains 330 tombs. That makes it the largest single-site mummy discovery in the world. When Chinese archaeologists excavated it in the early 2000s, after the site had been lost and relocated multiple times over the previous century, they found something that shocked them. The preservation was perfect. Bodies from 3,500 years ago that looked like they might have died recently. Hair intact, facial features clear, clothing remarkably well preserved. Even the wooden structures of the graves had survived. But it was what surrounded the cemetery that really grabbed attention. Tall wooden poles, over 100 of them, some standing 13 feet high, marking graves across the landscape like a forest of monuments. And the poles were shaped, deliberately carved. Some looked like oars. Others were unmistakably phallic. We'll come back to those poles later, because they're part of a larger mystery that we still haven't solved. But first, we need to talk about the most famous mummy of all. The one that changed everything. The one that sparked decades of debate and controversy. The beauty of Lulan. She was discovered on April 1st, 1980, April Fool's Day, which is ironic, because at first, no one could believe what they were seeing. A team led by archaeologist Mu Xunying was making a film about the Silk Road. They were exploring near Lop Nur, the dried lake bed, that vast expanse of nothing that used to be called the Wandering Lake because it would shift position as rivers changed course over centuries. Lop Nur had a strange history. The Tarim River would periodically change its course, flowing to different basins, so the lake itself seemed to wander across the landscape. Ancient Chinese texts described it as mysterious, unstable. Early 20th century explorers were confused about its exact location because maps from different eras showed it in different places. By 1980, Lop Nur had been dry for years. The last water had evaporated in the 1970s. What remained was a vast salt flat, blindingly white, visible from space. And it had gained a new, darker purpose. China had been conducting nuclear tests there since 1964. 45 nuclear explosions in that dry basin over 30 years. Mushroom clouds rising where ancient peoples had once fished and gathered reeds. The same extreme dryness that once supported ancient civilizations made it suitable for weapons testing. And there, in this nuclear testing ground, they found her. A woman who'd been dead for 3,800 years. Her face peaceful. Her hair still braided in an elaborate style. Her clothing well preserved. Even her eyelashes were still visible. The irony was profound. Humanity's most destructive technology being tested in the exact location where nature had created perfect preservation. Death and life. Destruction and eternal preservation. All in the same desolate landscape. They nicknamed her the Beauty of Lulan, and she became a sensation. Not just scientifically, but politically, because she had Caucasian features, high cheekbones, a narrow face, light brown hair that still held its color after thousands of years, and that raised questions, immediate questions. Who were these people? Where did they come from? What were they doing in Western China thousands of years before recorded history? Suggested Western and Eastern populations had significant contact. When other mummies from the region were studied, the pattern held. Many had European-looking features. Some had blonde or reddish hair, red highlights and braids that should have turned to dust millennia ago. Their skull shapes suggested Western ancestry, and some were remarkably tall by ancient standards, over 6 feet. The physical evidence seemed overwhelming. These looked like Europeans. They couldn't be anything else, or so everyone thought. For decades, everyone assumed the answer was obvious. They must be migrants. Indo-Europeans who traveled east, perhaps related to the Celtic or Germanic tribes of Europe, maybe ancestors of the Tocharians, an Indo-European people known to have lived in the region in historical times. Their presence in the Tarim Basin proved that Western populations had spread far into Asia in ancient times. It was a neat story, and the physical evidence seemed to support it completely. Books were written, documentaries were made. Museums displayed the mummies with labels, identifying them as Western migrants. The theory became accepted wisdom, and that assumption had modern political implications. The Uyghur people, who are the largest ethnic minority in Xinjiang today, claimed the mummies as their ancestors, as proof that they were indigenous to the region, that they had been there for thousands of years before the Han Chinese arrived. This was important for claims of cultural autonomy and indigenous rights. The Chinese government, conversely, was nervous about these claims. They worried that identifying the mummies as non-Chinese would fuel separatist movements, would provide justification for Uyghur independence activists. So they initially forbade DNA testing, refused to allow foreign researchers access to the mummies, kept the evidence locked away. But in 1993, DNA samples were smuggled out, hidden, taken to laboratories that could analyze them. And the political battle began in earnest. Whose ancestors were these? Who had the right to claim them? Both sides were confident they would win. The Uyghurs believed the DNA would prove Western ancestry. The Chinese government hoped it would show connection to East Asian populations. Everyone had theories. Everyone had expectations. And as we now know, everyone was wrong. But before we get to that revelation, it's worth pausing to consider what was at stake. These weren't just academic questions. They were identity questions, political questions, questions about who belonged where, about history as justification for present-day claims, about how genetics can be weaponized in ethnic conflicts. The mummies became symbols, propaganda tools, evidence in a dispute that had nothing to do with the actual people who died thousands of years ago. Those ancient residents of the Tarim Basin never imagined their bodies would be caught up in 21st century nationalism. But that's what happened. And when scientists finally got the technology and access to sequence ancient DNA from these mummies properly, when they could finally answer the question of genetic origin definitively, the results would shock everyone involved. The mummies weren't foreigners, they weren't migrants, and their story was stranger and more fascinating than anyone had guessed. 2021. A century after the first Terra mummies were discovered, decades after the political battles over their identity began, scientists finally published the most comprehensive genetic analysis ever conducted on these ancient people. The study was massive, an international collaboration. Researchers from Jilin University in China, the Max Planck Institute in Germany, Harvard University in the United States, Seoul National University in Korea, some of the world's leading experts in ancient DNA analysis. They analyzed DNA from 13 mummies at Shaohe and other early Bronze Age sites, using cutting-edge ancient DNA techniques that could extract and sequence genetic information from samples thousands of years old, from bone, from teeth, from tissue that had been desiccated for millennia but still retained enough genetic material to tell its story. The technical challenges were immense. Ancient DNA is fragmented, degraded, often contaminated with modern DNA or environmental bacteria. But these researchers had developed methods to isolate and sequence even the most damaged samples, to piece together genetic profiles from fragments, to reconstruct ancestry from tiny scraps of information. And what they found changed everything. The mummies weren't Western migrants. They weren't Indo-Europeans who traveled east. They weren't related to Celtic or Germanic peoples. They weren't ancestors of anyone living in the region today. They were something far stranger. The Tarim Basin mummies were direct descendants of a population called the Ancient North Eurasians, the Aeni, a group of Ice Age hunter-gatherers who'd lived across a vast territory stretching from Siberia to Europe during the last glacial period. These were the people who survived the Ice Age, who hunted mammoth and reindeer, who adapted to some of the harshest conditions humans have ever faced. But here's the thing. Scientists thought the ancient North Eurasians had essentially vanished 10,000 years ago. As the Ice Age ended, as climates warmed and populations shifted, the Aeni mixed with other groups. Their genetic legacy was absorbed into other populations. They ceased to exist as a distinct group. By the Bronze Age, they were gone, diluted beyond recognition, except in the Tarim Basin. Somehow, in this isolated desert, they survived, unchanged, hidden, a living remnant of the Ice Age persisting for thousands of years after everyone else thought they were gone. It's like finding a pocket of Neanderthals alive in the 20th century. That's how unexpected this discovery was. The mummies had 72% A&E ancestry. The rest, 28%, came from ancient Northeast Asian populations. But crucially, they had zero detectable ancestry from the Western steppe peoples. None. The populations that most scientists had assumed they descended from left no genetic trace whatsoever. It was the exact opposite of what everyone expected. For a century, the assumption had been migration from west to east. But the DNA showed something else entirely. These people were already there. They'd been there since the Ice Age. They were the original residents, the indigenous population, not migrants at all. And here's where it gets even more fascinating. The genetic analysis revealed something almost unbelievable about how isolated these people were. Individuals buried at opposite ends of the Tarim Basin, separated by over 400 kilometers, were as genetically similar to each other as modern siblings. Think about that. Siblings, people from the same parents, Except these weren't siblings. They lived 400 kilometers apart in different communities. Probably never met each other, never knew each other existed. The genetic similarity was 92%. That's not just close relatives. That's sibling-level connection across vast distances. To put that in perspective, most people share about 50% of their DNA with their siblings. 92% similarity is extraordinary, almost impossible in a normal, healthy population. It suggests an extremely small founding population that experienced what geneticists call a severe bottleneck, a moment when the population crashed to very small numbers and never really expanded beyond that. Maybe disease, maybe environmental catastrophe, maybe they were always small. But whatever the cause, this population remained tiny, reproductively isolated, intermarrying within their group for generation after generation after generation. These people were essentially one extended family, spread across a huge desert basin, marrying within their group for thousands of years, maintaining genetic isolation that's almost unprecedented in human history. But here's the paradox that makes this discovery so remarkable. While they were genetically isolated, they were culturally cosmopolitan, wide open to ideas from outside, eager to adopt new technologies, connected to the broader world in every way except genetically. They weren't farmers originally. Hunting and gathering was their ancestral lifestyle, but they adopted agriculture. Wheat farming came from the West. They learned it, integrated it into their lives. But they didn't interbreed with the farmers who taught them. They started keeping dairy cattle, sheep and goats too. This technology spread across Central Asia during the Bronze Age, brought by migrating pastoralists from the steppes. The Tarim people adopted it enthusiastically. Analysis of their dental calculus, the hardened plaque on their teeth, showed they consumed milk products regularly. The calcium signatures, the protein residues, all the evidence of a dairy-heavy diet. But genetic testing showed they lacked lactase persistence, the genetic mutation that allows adults to digest lactose without getting sick. Most humans lose the ability to digest lactose after childhood, but populations that have kept dairy animals for thousands of years evolved this mutation. It's common in Europeans, in some African groups, in Central Asian pastoralists, but not in the Tarim people. They lacked it completely. So how did they consume dairy without getting sick? They fermented it. They made cheese and yogurt and kefir. We know this because some of those cheese products were found around the mummies' necks. 3,600 years old, still preserved. And genetic analysis of the cheese identified the exact bacteria used. Lactobacillus kefirinofaciens, the same bacteria used in modern kefir. The fermentation process broke down the lactose, making the dairy digestible even for people who couldn't handle fresh milk. They wore complex textiles, twill weaves, plaid patterns that look remarkably similar to Scottish tartan. These weaving techniques came from the West, from Indo-European populations. The Tarim people learned them, mastered them, created sophisticated clothing using these foreign methods, but they didn't marry the people who taught them. It's as if they built walls around their genes, but left doors wide open for ideas. Information flowed in freely. Technology was welcomed. Agricultural techniques, weaving methods, animal husbandry practices, all adopted enthusiastically. But the people themselves, they stayed separate. The genetic evidence is overwhelming. For thousands of years, they maintained this remarkable isolation while simultaneously engaging with the wider world. One of the lead researchers, Christina Warner from Harvard, put it perfectly. She said, "Despite being genetically isolated, the Bronze Age peoples of the Tarim Basin were remarkably culturally cosmopolitan." That's the paradox. biological islands, cultural bridges, genetic fortresses with intellectual doors wide open. Why? Why would a population maintain such strict genetic isolation while being so open culturally? We don't know for certain. It could have been deliberate cultural practice, rules about marriage, taboos against mixing with outsiders, or it could have been circumstantial. Perhaps they were simply too spread out across the desert, too sparse. Contact happened, but not frequently enough for significant interbreeding. Or maybe their isolation was the reason they could be so open culturally. When you're confident in your own identity, when your group's genetic integrity isn't threatened, perhaps you can afford to borrow ideas freely. You can adopt innovations without fear of losing who you are. Whatever the reason, this discovery completely overturned a century of assumptions. Museums had to change their labels. Textbooks needed updating. Documentaries that confidently declared these people were Western migrants were suddenly obsolete. And politically, it deflated everyone's claims. The Uyghurs couldn't point to these mummies as their ancestors. The genetic connection wasn't there, but the Chinese government couldn't claim them either. These people predated both modern ethnic groups by thousands of years. They belonged to neither. Or perhaps they belonged to both, as part of the deep human history of the region that transcends modern ethnic categories. Science had answered one mystery definitively. These weren't foreigners. They were Ice Age survivors who'd maintained the most remarkable genetic isolation in human history while remaining culturally connected to the world around them. But that answer raised new questions and revealed new mysteries. Because when you can answer who they were genetically, the next question becomes, what were their lives actually like? What did they eat? Where? How did they die? What did they believe? And the desert, in its patient preservation, had answers to those questions too. Sometimes the most powerful historical discoveries aren't the big political events or the grand theories. They're the small things, the everyday details that make ancient people suddenly feel real. The Tarim Basin preserved those details better than almost anywhere else on Earth. Let's start with food, because nothing makes the past feel more immediate than realizing someone's meal from 1300 years ago looks exactly like something you could order tonight. In the Astana cemetery near Gaochang, archaeologists found dumplings, Tang Dynasty dumplings from the 7th and 8th century CE, and they look absolutely identical to modern Chinese dumplings. Same shape, same size, same folded wrapper style. The crimped edges where fingers pinched the dough closed, the slight bulge in the middle where the filling sits. If you put a photo of them next to a plate of dumplings from any Chinese restaurant, you couldn't tell which was which, except one is from your dinner last week and the other is 13 centuries old. The stuffing is still inside, though after 13 centuries, identifying what exactly that stuffing was is no longer possible. But microscopic analysis of the dough showed it was made from wheat flour mixed with foxtail millet, a combination that provided both texture and nutrition. About 20 of these perfectly preserved dumplings have been found so far, each one a little time capsule of culinary tradition. One, the preservation is so perfect that you can see the texture of the dough, the places where the wrapper was pinched and folded, the slight variations in size that come from handmade food. These weren't mass-produced. Someone sat down and made each one, filled them, folded them, placed them in a vessel to accompany someone to the afterlife. And 1,300 years later, they look fresh enough that you almost feel you shouldn't touch them, like they're someone's dinner, and you'd be rude to disturb it. But the really extraordinary food discovery came from Shaohe Cemetery, from burials that are much older, over 3,000 years old. And what they found confused archaeologists for decades. There were these yellowish chunks, hard, dense, crumbly, arranged around some of the mummies' necks, like necklaces or protective amulets. They didn't look like food. They looked like rocks or fossilized wood. For years, no one was quite sure what they were. They were cataloged, stored, photographed, but their purpose remained mysterious until 2024, when scientists finally managed to extract and sequence DNA from these mysterious objects. And the answer was both simple and extraordinary. They were cheese, the oldest cheese ever discovered, 3,600 years old, made with bacteria and yeast that are still used in modern kefir production. Lactobacillus kefirinofaciens and Pitia kudryavzevii, the same microorganisms, evolved over 36 centuries, but fundamentally recognizable. The cheese was made from cow and goat milk. Interestingly, each cheese was from a single species, not mixed. Cow milk cheese and goat milk cheese kept separate, which is different from Middle Eastern and Greek cheese-making traditions where milks were often blended. Why wear cheese as a necklace? We can't know for certain. It might have been food for the journey to the afterlife, a practical provision for the dead. Or perhaps the kefir culture itself had symbolic meaning. These bacteria transform milk into something completely different, something that lasts. Maybe that transformation resonated with beliefs about death and the afterlife. Transformation from one state to another. Whatever the reason, we now know that these people were making and wearing the world's oldest cheese 36 centuries ago in the heart of the desert. But preservation went beyond food. It extended to the intimate details of individual lives. Take the beauty of Lulan. We've already talked about her discovery and her role in political controversies. But when scientists actually examined her body closely, they found something surprising and deeply human. She died from pollution, ancient air pollution. Her lungs were filled with sand particles, dust, and charcoal. The constant inhalation of smoke from cooking fires, combined with the harsh desert air full of fine particles, had destroyed her respiratory system over years. Scarring, inflammation, progressive damage that would have made breathing increasingly difficult. She likely died in her early 40s from respiratory failure, struggling for breath, drowning in air that couldn't nourish her damaged lungs. Lung disease killed people 3,800 years ago, just as surely as it does today. Her clothing had been mended. Multiple times, the repairs were visible. Patches over worn areas. Careful stitching to extend the life of the fabric. She wasn't wealthy. She couldn't afford to simply replace worn clothing. She made do. She fixed what she had. And her hair was infested with lice. The evidence was still there after thousands of years. This was an ordinary person dealing with ordinary problems. Poverty, poor air quality, parasites, the daily struggles of survival in a harsh environment. Yet the Chinese government's archaeologist Wang Binghua said something wonderfully dry about her lung disease. You can see that even back then, pollution was a problem, as if ancient air pollution is somehow less serious than modern pollution. But for her, it was just as deadly. The beauty of Lulan reminds us that ancient people suffered in ways we still understand. That hardship transcends centuries. That a woman struggling to breathe in 1800 BCE and someone struggling with respiratory disease today are connected by the same human vulnerability. And then there's Shaman and his family. This burial is perhaps the most emotionally powerful of all the Tarim discoveries. The man was buried wearing remarkable clothing, a red twill tunic, tartan pattern leggings that wouldn't look out of place in modern Scotland, white deerskin boots, striped felt socks, and hats. So many hats. 10 different hats were found in his grave. 10. That's not practical. That's not ceremonial. That's fashion. That's personal expression. That's someone who genuinely loved hats, who collected them, who cared about how he looked, and wanted to be buried with his collection. His face had been painted with ochre pigments, yellow and purple spirals, sun symbols spreading across his cheeks and forehead. Often these have been described as tattoos, but they were actually cosmetics. Paint applied to the skin that survived for 3,000 years. Someone took the time to paint his face for burial, to prepare him carefully for his journey to whatever came next. He died around age 50, probably from disease, and he was buried beside 3 women and a baby. That baby is what breaks your heart. The infant was only 3 months old, dressed in a bright blue cashmere bonnet, blue. That color still visible after millennia. Bright and cheerful against the inevitability of death. And there were tiny tufts of red wool carefully inserted into the baby's nostrils. Small blue stones placed above the closed eyes. These aren't random details. These are ritual. Someone who was grieving took the time to perform these careful, tender rituals, to prepare this tiny body with as much care as they would an adult, maybe more. The baby has been nicknamed Baby Bluebonnet, and despite the cheerful nickname, there's profound sadness here. This was a loved child, someone's son or daughter. The care taken in the burial shows how much this death mattered. 3 months. Old enough to have a personality, to smile, to be recognized, to be loved completely. And then gone. The family was buried together. The man, the women, the baby. We don't know their exact relationships. Father and mothers, extended family, but they were connected in life and in death. The desert preserved that connection, froze that moment of loss. When you look at the photos of this burial, you're not seeing abstract archaeology. You're seeing grief, love, the universal human response to loss that connects us across thousands of years and completely different cultures. And that's what makes these preserved details so powerful. They're not just scientific data, they're bridges, connections between then and now, between them and us. A man who loved hats, a woman killed by bad air, a baby buried with tender care, dumplings that look like they could have been made yesterday, cheese worn as jewelry. These aren't distant historical figures. They're people, people we could know, people we could be. The desert gave them a kind of immortality. Not because it preserved their names or their great achievements, but because it preserved the small things, the everyday details, the human details, the parts that make us recognize ourselves in them. And those details lead us to one of the greatest mysteries of all, a burial practice so strange, so seemingly paradoxical, that after decades of research, we still don't fully understand it. Picture this. You're standing in the middle of one of the driest deserts on Earth, the Taklamakan, the Sea of Death. You're hundreds of miles from any ocean, hundreds of miles from any major lake or sea. The nearest substantial body of water requires crossing mountains or deserts that would take weeks of travel. And you're looking at boats, dozens of them, sticking up out of the sand like a strange forest. Not real boats, exactly. They're grave markers, 13-foot-tall wooden poles carved to look like oars. And beneath them, buried in the sand, are coffins shaped like boats, covered with cattle hides, laid out as if they're vessels ready to sail. This is Xiaohe Cemetery, and this practice, this strange blending of death and boats in a place with no water, is one of archaeology's enduring mysteries. The coffins themselves are shaped like upturned boats. The wooden planks curved carefully to form a hull, bent and lashed together with skill that suggests these people knew boats, understood their construction. Cattle hides stretched over the top, creating a sealed chamber, and rising from them, those enormous poles standing upright, visible from a distance. For men's graves, the poles were shaped like oars, long, flat-bladed, paddles for an imagined journey across waters that didn't exist. For women's graves, the poles were phallic, enormous wooden phalluses, 13 feet tall, marking graves across the desert landscape. Not subtle, not hidden, proudly displayed. The symbolism is inverted. You'd expect phallic symbols for men. That's the pattern in most cultures where sexual symbolism appears in burial contexts. But no, the men got oars. The women got the sexual imagery. There's meaning there, but we don't fully understand it. The inversion itself seems deliberate, important. Some graves also contained actual wooden phalluses, placed inside the boat coffins, sometimes laid directly on the body. One burial had a life-size wooden phallus positioned on a woman's chest. This wasn't subtle. This wasn't hidden. It was central to their burial practice. But let's set aside the sexual symbolism for a moment. We'll come back to that. Right now, let's focus on the boats. Why boats? Why would desert people living in one of the most arid places on Earth bury their dead in vessels designed for water? After decades of research and hundreds of excavations, we still don't have a definitive answer. But we have theories, and each one reveals something about how these people might have understood life, death, and the world around them. The boats honor water itself. Despite the harsh desert surrounding them, these people lived at oases. They depended absolutely on water from rivers fed by mountain snowmelt. Those rivers were life. Everything else was death. Water meant crops, drinking, survival. So perhaps the boats were tribute to that precious, life-giving element. Recognition that water made existence possible, that without it, nothing survives. That water was the difference between life and the wasteland, visible in every direction. Archaeological evidence supports this connection. Ancient fishing nets have been found at Tarim Basin sites, carefully woven, made to catch specific sizes of fish. These people fished. They knew rivers and water intimately, even if they lived surrounded by sand. Palynological studies, analysis of ancient pollen preserved in the soil, show that Shaohe was located near extensive wetlands 3,000 years ago. Cattails and reeds grew nearby. Water birds nested. This wasn't pure desert. It was an oasis surrounded by desert. And that oasis included open water, ponds, maybe even small lakes fed by rivers that have since changed course or dried up entirely. So the boats might represent that essential water source, the foundation of their survival, a way of acknowledging that their entire existence depended on something precious and scarce. Theory 2. The boats are vehicles for an afterlife journey. Many cultures around the world have conceptualized death as a journey, a voyage to another realm. And if death is travel, then you need transportation. Egyptian boats buried with pharaohs, Viking ships burned or buried with warriors, Polynesian canoes prepared for chiefs' final journeys. The idea that death requires a vessel to carry the soul to its destination is nearly universal. Perhaps the Tarim people believed the afterlife existed across some metaphorical water, a river or sea that separated the living from the dead. You die here, but you wake up there, on the other side. And to get there, you need to cross. And the boats, even buried in sand, were meant to ferry the deceased across that divide. The oar poles could be literal paddles for that journey, tools to navigate between worlds, between life and whatever comes after. One researcher, Gino Caspari, suggested that the boat-like coffins and attached poles may have stood for paddles and mooring posts, tools designed to guide and anchor the deceased on a mirrored afterlife journey. A mirrored journey. Life here, life there, with water as the boundary between them. The dead don't walk to the afterlife. They sail. And they need boats for that voyage just as surely as the living need boats to cross earthly waters. Theory 3. Cultural memory. This one is more speculative. Perhaps the Terran people's ancestors came from somewhere with more water, somewhere where boats were practical, not symbolic. And as they migrated to this desert basin, they brought the practice with them. Generation after generation maintained the tradition. Even as its practical connection to water faded, the boats became purely ritual, a way of connecting to ancestral homeland, to a time when their people lived near rivers or seas. We know from the DNA evidence that these people had been genetically isolated for thousands of years. But genetic isolation doesn't mean their ancestors were always in this exact location. They could have come from elsewhere long, long ago, before the genetic bottleneck, before the isolation, and brought boat burial practices from that earlier homeland. But here's the thing. We don't actually know, and that's okay. Not every mystery needs to be solved. Not every ancient practice needs to be explained. Sometimes the value is in the wondering, in contemplating the possibilities, in recognizing that human motivations can be complex and that meaning can be layered. What we do know is that this practice was important to them, important enough to invest enormous labor. Shaping those massive oar poles would have taken days or weeks per pole. Carving boat-shaped coffins, preparing cattle hides, erecting these monuments that would stand for thousands of years. This wasn't casual. This was central to their beliefs about death. Michael Fricketti, an anthropologist who studied the Tarim cultures, put it perfectly. They bury their bodies in boats, and no one else does that. That means where that tradition comes from remains one of the biggest enigmas of this desert population, which should be the last community in the world to do this. The last community in the world. In the harshest desert, burying people in boats. It doesn't make practical sense, but it made spiritual sense. It made emotional sense. It connected them to something meaningful, even if we can't fully grasp what that meaning was. And that's part of the beauty of archaeology. Sometimes we get clear answers. The DNA tells us definitively who these people were genetically. But other times, we get mysteries. Practices we can observe and document, but not fully explain. And those mysteries remind us that ancient people weren't just data points. They were humans with complex beliefs and symbolic systems and spiritual lives that might remain forever opaque to us. The boat burials stand as markers, not just of graves, but of the limits of our understanding, of the eternal gap between observing what people did and knowing why they did it. Perhaps they would have been amused that thousands of years later, we're still puzzling over their choices. Or perhaps they'd be satisfied that the mystery endures, that their beliefs retain some power and wonder even across impossible spans of time. The boats remain, the bones rest within them, and the desert keeps its secrets, even as it reveals so much else. We've mentioned the phallic poles at Shaohu Cemetery, those 13-foot wooden monuments marking women's graves, but we haven't fully addressed what they mean. And it's worth doing so, because the sexual symbolism at Shaohu isn't subtle or hidden. It dominates the entire landscape. Victor Mayer, the archaeologist who studied these sites extensively, described it bluntly. The whole of the cemetery was blanketed with blatant sexual symbolism. Blanketed, not decorated, not touched by. Blanketed, as in completely covered. Imagine standing at the edge of Shaohe Cemetery, as it must have looked thousands of years ago. Dozens of tall wooden poles rising from the sand like a forest, each one 13 feet high, each one carved with unmistakable intentionality. The scale alone would have been overwhelming. These weren't small markers easily overlooked. They dominated the visual landscape for anyone approaching. You would have seen them from a distance, known immediately what you were looking at. A cemetery, a sacred space, a place where the dead rested beneath these towering monuments. The phallic poles for women's graves were massive, not just symbols, monuments, declarations. When you look at photos of the cemetery during excavation, you see this forest of wooden phalluses rising from the sand. Dozens of them still standing after thousands of years. Weathered but unmistakable. It's visually striking in a way that's almost overwhelming. The people who carved and erected these monuments wanted to make absolutely certain the symbolism could not be misunderstood or ignored. This wasn't subtle spirituality. This was bold, direct, impossible to miss. And it wasn't just the... Inside the coffins, wooden phalluses were found, sometimes multiple per burial. One woman was found with a life-size wooden phallus laid directly on her body, not beside her. On her. The men's graves, meanwhile, had those oar-shaped poles, and some researchers interpret these as vulva symbols, ovals, openings, the inverse of the phallic imagery. So the symbolism is gendered, but inverted. Men get feminine symbols. Women get masculine symbols. There's meaning in that inversion, but like so much else, we can only speculate about what it is. Beyond the grave markers, there's more. Women were buried with cosmetic sticks, small implements for applying makeup, red pigment made from hematite powder mixed with something unusual, cattle hearts, actual preserved cattle hearts, ground up and combined with red iron oxide to create makeup. When researchers analyzed these cosmetic sticks in a 2016 study using proteomics, they discovered the hearts were specifically chosen. This wasn't random or convenient. This wasn't just using whatever binding agent was available. The heart is the center of blood circulation, the organ that pumps life through the body, the source, in their understanding, of the life force itself. And women were using these heart-derived cosmetics to paint red lines on their faces and bodies, particularly on foreheads, making the invisible visible. Blood, life, the essence of existence made into decoration worn for all to see. The heart's power worn on the skin. The connection between blood, life, and fertility wasn't abstract for these people. It was immediate, daily, crucial. When we see these monuments today, it's natural to wonder what they meant. For a small, isolated community living in one of Earth's harshest environments, fertility wasn't an abstract spiritual concept. It was everything. Survival itself. We know from the DNA evidence that this was an extremely small, isolated population. The genetic similarity across hundreds of kilometers was extraordinary. 92% similarity between people who lived hundreds of miles apart. That suggests they started from a tiny founding group. Maybe a few dozen individuals, maybe fewer. They probably went through a severe bottleneck at some point, some crisis that reduced their numbers dramatically. Disease, environmental catastrophe, something that pushed them to the brink. And after that, every child born represented the community's future. Every pregnancy carried the weight of collective survival. Every woman who could bear children was precious. Every birth was celebrated not just by a family, but by everyone who understood that their continued existence depended on the next generation. In that context, fertility wasn't just important, it was everything. The difference between continuation and extinction, between having a future and simply fading away into the desert. Think about what that means for daily life, for how you see the world, when every pregnancy matters so much, when every birth is celebrated not just by a family, but by an entire community whose survival depends on it. When the act of bringing new life into the world is literally what keeps your people from vanishing. The symbolism at Shaohe makes sense in that light. Those 13-foot monuments weren't crude or shocking to the people who erected them. They were honest, direct, a clear statement about what mattered most, about what kept this small group of people alive in an impossible place. The cattle heart cosmetics show the same understanding. Blood is life. The heart pumps blood. Therefore, the heart is the source of life itself. Make it visible. Wear it, honor it. The logic is simple and profound. Some researchers call this a fertility cult, suggesting religious ritual around reproduction. Others push back, saying that imposes our ideas about what's sacred versus what's simply practical. That we're reading taboo into practices that might not have been taboo at all for the people performing them. Maybe the truth is somewhere between. Maybe the phallic poles were both practical markers and sacred symbols. Maybe there wasn't a sharp line between the spiritual and the everyday for these people. Maybe everything was sacred when survival was so uncertain. What we can say definitively is that these symbols were important, that the Shaohe people invested enormous effort in creating them, that sexual and reproductive imagery was central to their burial practices, and that whatever it meant to them, it was worth doing conspicuously, publicly, on a massive scale. And, in a way, whether it was religious or practical doesn't really matter, because either way, it shows what was at stake for this isolated population. Survival, continuation, making sure there would be another generation, and another. For as long as possible, reproduction wasn't just biological for them. It couldn't be. When your entire community is genetically equivalent to an extended family, when everyone is related to everyone else at a sibling level, when the population is so small that any disaster could wipe you out, then having children is a communal act. It's survival for everyone, not just the parents. That's a pressure most modern people don't experience. We don't live in communities where every birth directly impacts everyone's survival, where population decline means actual extinction within a few generations. For them, that was reality, daily, constant. The monuments they built reflect that reality. Those 13-foot wooden poles standing in the desert, visible from a distance, marking the graves of women. Not hidden, not subtle, impossible to miss or misunderstand. These people knew what their survival depended on. They made it visible, made it central to how they honored their dead, made it part of the landscape itself. When we look at Shaohe Cemetery today, we're seeing a community's answer to an existential question. How do you survive in a place that wants to kill you? How do you keep going when your numbers are so small that every loss threatens everything? You remember what matters. You monumentalize it. You make certain that everyone, living and dead, knows what keeps the community alive. The sexual symbolism at Shaohe might shock us, but shock isn't always bad. Sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes the most important things need to be stated clearly, bluntly, without embarrassment or apology. For this small, isolated community in one of Earth's harshest environments, fertility was life. and they weren't shy about saying so. The Tarim Basin wasn't monolithic. It was never one culture with one set of beliefs. It was a patchwork, a collection of communities separated by distance and time, each finding their own ways to understand the sacred, to connect with forces larger than themselves, to make sense of life and death in a harsh and unforgiving landscape. Some sought connection through altered states of consciousness, through plants that changed perception, through rituals that dissolved the boundaries between the human world and whatever lay beyond. Others claimed spiritual authority through distinctive dress, through symbols worn that set them apart from ordinary people, through appearance itself as a statement of power. And all of them, despite their isolation, maintained mysterious connections to distant peoples and cultures, through technologies like weaving, through practices whose origins we still can't fully trace, through knowledge that somehow traveled across impossible distances. These weren't random curiosities. They were different answers to the same fundamental questions. How do you survive? How do you find meaning? How do you connect to something larger when you're so small and the world is so vast? Let's talk about the cannabis shaman. In 2003, archaeologists excavating at Yanghai tombs near Turpan found something unusual, a grave containing the skeleton of a 45-year-old man. The bones were disarticulated, meaning they weren't in normal anatomical position. This suggested he died somewhere else, probably in the highlands, and his bones had been brought down for burial later, a secondary burial. Near his head and feet were a leather basket and a wooden bowl, and inside them was cannabis, a lot of cannabis. 789 grams, that's over 1.5 pounds. And remarkably, after 2,700 years, it was still green looking. The distinctive odor had faded, but the color remained. This wasn't hemp for making rope or fabric. Analysis published in the Journal of Experimental Botany showed the plants contained THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, the psychoactive compound. This cannabis was specifically cultivated for its mind-altering properties, for spiritual or medicinal use. This is the oldest known pharmacological use of cannabis ever documented. The man was also buried with bells attached to his boots, bells that would have jingled as he moved, and a kongu harp, musical instruments, items suggesting ritual performance, dancing, perhaps, or ceremonies involving altered states of consciousness. Put it together: cannabis, musical instruments, bells for dancing, a special burial for someone whose bones were brought from far away. This was likely a shaman, a spiritual specialist who used psychoactive plants to facilitate communication between the human world and the spirit world. And the amount of cannabis suggests this wasn't occasional use. 789 grams is significant. That's more than most users today would keep on hand. It suggests cannabis was central to his practice, essential to whatever rituals he performed. It's easy to make jokes about this. The ancient shaman with his stash and his dancing bells. And there's humor there, but there's also something deeper. This was someone whose role in the community was valuable enough that people carried his bones down from the mountains to bury them properly. Someone whose spiritual work mattered, whose altered states of consciousness were seen as meaningful, important, worth preserving. His legacy with the very plants he used in life. Cannabis as a gateway to the spirit world. That was his answer to the question of how to connect, how to see beyond the visible, how to access wisdom or power or understanding that ordinary consciousness couldn't reach. Others found different ways to mark spiritual authority, through appearance, through clothing that set them apart and made their role unmistakable. The Witches of Subeishi. 3 female mummies found at Subeishi, also near Turpan, wearing the most remarkable hats. Tall, pointed, black felt. They look exactly, and I mean exactly, like the stereotypical witch hats from Western fairy tales and Halloween costumes. These women died between the 4th and 2nd centuries BCE, thousands of years before European witch trials, thousands of years before the pointed black hat became associated with witchcraft in Western culture. Yet here they are, wearing virtually identical headwear. The similarity is so striking that when photos first circulated, people thought it was a joke. But it's real, and it raises interesting questions about where cultural imagery comes from, about independent invention versus cultural transmission, about why certain shapes and styles might resonate across completely different times and cultures. The tall conical hats likely indicated status, priestesses perhaps, or shamans, women with spiritual authority. The shape makes the wearer taller, more imposing. It draws the eye upward. It creates presence, practical and symbolic at once. While the cannabis shaman sought connection through altered consciousness, these women claimed authority through appearance, through hats that made them unmistakable, different, set apart from ordinary people. Another answer to the same question: how do you bridge the human and the divine? How do you claim a role as intermediary? And then there's something else, something that connects these desert communities to peoples thousands of miles away, a mystery of cultural transmission that we still don't fully understand. The tartan connection. The textiles found on Tarim mummies aren't just any cloth. They're sophisticated plaid patterns using twill weave construction, multiple colors, complex designs. Some fabrics used 6 different thread colors. That requires planning, dyeing technology, weaving skill. This isn't simple fabric. This is technological achievement, and these patterns match almost exactly. Textiles found at Hallstatt in Austria, 4,000 miles away, dating to roughly the same period, the same weave structure, the same alternating thick and thin color bands, the same basic approach to creating plaid. Elizabeth Wayland Barber, a textile expert who studied these fabrics, was struck by the similarity. This isn't just people in 2 places deciding to use multiple colors. This is a specific technical tradition, a way of constructing fabric that appears in both locations. Cultural diffusion, knowledge traveling across Eurasia through chains of contact we can barely trace, or convergent evolution. 2 separate communities, independently developing the same solution. We don't know for certain, but here's what we do know. The Tarim people, despite their genetic isolation, were culturally open. They adopted ideas from far away: wheat farming, dairy cattle, textile techniques, all arrived without the people who invented them. Technology traveled, knowledge spread, even when genes didn't mix. The tartan fabrics are evidence of that openness, of connection across impossible distances, of communities that were isolated biologically but connected culturally. Churchin man wore tartan leggings, along with his 10 hats, dressed in finery that linked him to traditions from thousands of miles away. These 3 stories, the cannabis shaman, the witches of Subeshi, the tartan wearers, might seem unrelated at first, but they're all part of the same larger pattern. Different communities, different practices, different answers to fundamental questions. How do you access the sacred? Through plants? Through distinctive clothing? Through rituals we can only guess at? How do you maintain identity in isolation? Through practices that set you apart? Through symbols that mean something to your community, even if outsiders don't understand them? How do you stay connected to the wider world? Through technologies that travel, through knowledge that spreads even when people stay put, through textiles and tools and ideas that bridge vast distances. The Tarim Basin was never one culture. It was many cultures, a patchwork of communities adapted to the same harsh environment but maintaining their own identities, their own ways of understanding the world, their own answers to life's deepest questions, and all of them preserved by the same accident of climate, by the same dry air and saline soil and freezing winters that stopped time for their dead, giving us these windows into different ways of being human, different ways of seeking meaning, different ways of surviving and thriving in impossible places. Each discovery adds another layer to the story, another perspective, another voice from the past telling us that there's never just one way to live, one way to believe, one way to be. The desert preserved them all. The Cannabis Shaman, with his bells and his sacred plants, the women with their towering hats and spiritual authority, the people wearing tartans whose origins stretch across continents. All of them waited in the sand, patient and silent, until we were ready to listen to what they had to say. Everything ends. Even cities that stand for 1,400 years, even cultures that survive for millennia. Eventually, the desert claims everything. Gaochang fell in stages. The Tang dynasty ruled for over 2 centuries. Then the Uyghur kingdom of Kocho controlled the city for another 300 years, submitting to Mongol rule under Genghis Khan in 1209. For a time, under the Mongols, trade and culture continued. The Silk Road still functioned. Merchants still stopped here. The city adapted, survived, persisted as it had for over a millennium. But in the 14th century, everything collapsed. Warfare erupted between Mongol aristocrats and local populations. The Chagatai Khanate, one of the successor states to Genghis Khan's empire, brought massive forces into the region. Up to 120,000 troops, an army larger than the entire population of the region. Cities burned, populations fled or were killed. Trade routes were disrupted as the Yuan dynasty in China collapsed and the entire political order of Central Asia fractured. Gaochang was destroyed, not gradually, violently. The city that had survived invasions and cultural changes and dynasty after dynasty finally met its end in 14th century warfare. The walls were breached, buildings burned, and sometime around 1400 CE, the residents abandoned what remained. After abandonment, destruction continued. Muslims, considering Buddhist imagery blasphemous, destroyed many of the frescoes that had adorned temples. Local farmers, not yet understanding archaeological significance, removed soil from buildings to use as fertilizer. The elaborate paintings and carved walls that had survived centuries were scraped away or left to decay. By the time German expeditions arrived in the early 1900s, much had already been lost. But what remained was still significant enough that they removed thousands of manuscripts and artifacts. Many are now in German museums. Whether that was preservation or plunder depends on your perspective. But either way, Gaochang's treasures were scattered. Diaspora of objects from a dead city. What remains now are ruins. Impressive ruins, to be sure. Those massive walls still stand, at least partially, 12 meters thick, still defying gravity after centuries of neglect. The 3-part city structure is still visible from above. You can trace the streets, see where buildings once stood. But sand is gradually reclaiming everything. Each year, the desert advances. Dunes pile higher against walls that once held them back. Buildings collapse inward. Details erode. What took generations to build is being undone by wind and time. And the simple fact that nothing human lasts forever without constant maintenance. UNESCO recognized Gaochang as a World Heritage Site in 2014. Protection and preservation efforts are ongoing. Archaeologists work to stabilize structures, to document what remains before it's gone. But there's only so much you can do against the patient, relentless work of desert wind and sand. Eventually, even the walls will fall. The last traces will disappear, and Gaochang will be nothing but a name in historical records. The desert destroys. That's its nature. It's harsh and unforgiving, and eventually breaks down everything human beings try to build. But here's the paradox. Here's what makes this story so strange and so beautiful. The same desert that destroyed Gaochang preserved its people. The same extreme conditions that ended civilizations also created perfect conditions for natural mummification. The same aridity that made life so difficult made death remarkably gentle on human remains. Destruction and preservation. Two sides of the same environmental coin. Consider Lop Nur, once a great lake. The wandering lake, source of water and life for the ancient kingdom of Lulan and countless other communities. Fish swimming in its waters, reeds growing along its shores, birds nesting, moisture in the air, an oasis in the desert, a reason to live there, a reason to build a civilization in an otherwise impossible place. But rivers change course. Climate shifts, slowly at first, then faster. By the late 20th century, Lop Nur was completely dry, a vast salt flat, blindingly white, lifeless. Nothing grows, nothing lives. The transformation from life-giving lake to dead basin took centuries, but the endpoint was absolute, total desiccation, complete death. And then it became a nuclear testing ground. China conducted 45 nuclear tests there between 1964 and 1996. Mushroom clouds rising over the same ground where ancient peoples had once fished, the ultimate symbol of destruction, of human technological power turned toward annihilation. Yet that same dried lake bed, that nuclear testing ground, was where the beauty of Lulan was discovered, perfectly preserved for 3,800 years. The conditions that made the area suitable for nuclear weapons testing were the same conditions that had mummified her body so completely that archaeologists thought she died recently. Destruction and preservation, death and eternal life, all in the same landscape. It's a powerful reminder of nature's dual nature, of how context shapes meaning. The desert isn't good or bad, it just is. It operates according to physical laws that have nothing to do with human values. Extreme aridity, temperature swings, mineral-rich soils. These factors can kill or preserve depending on whether you're alive or dead. For the living, the desert was always a challenge, something to survive despite, something to engineer around. Water management, oasis cultivation, trade routes carefully planned to connect one pocket of habitability to another. Life was possible, but only with constant effort, constant vigilance. For the dead, the desert was a vault, a preserver more reliable than any human technique. It asked nothing, did nothing actively, just provided conditions so extreme that normal decay couldn't happen. And in doing so, it gave these ancient people a kind of immortality. Not the immortality they might have hoped for, not eternal life in a paradise, not conscious existence in an afterlife, but something perhaps just as valuable. The ability to be seen, to be studied, to be known by people thousands of years in the future. Those 1,300-year-old dumplings tell us about Tang Dynasty foodways. The 3,600-year-old cheese reveals fermentation technology. The perfectly preserved clothing shows us ancient fashion and textile technique. Every mummy is a message from the past, a communication across impossible time spans, and all of it made possible by the same conditions that destroyed the cities they lived in. There's a lesson here about impermanence, about how even the greatest human achievements eventually return to dust. Gaochang's walls will continue to crumble. Eventually, nothing will remain but vague shapes in the sand. The city will be completely erased. But the people buried outside those walls might last indefinitely, as long as the desert conditions remain extreme, as long as the climate stays dry, as long as someone is around to discover them and protect them. They could survive for thousands more years, outlasting the civilization that created them by immense spans of time. The desert doesn't care about any of this. It doesn't favor preservation over destruction. It doesn't make moral judgments. It simply is. And in being what it is, harsh, dry, extreme, it shaped the story of these ancient peoples in ways both terrible and wonderful. It gave them life through oasis waters. It took that life through harsh conditions and eventual environmental collapse. And then it gave them another kind of existence, preserved, eternal, waiting in the sand to tell their story to whoever would listen. We started with a face, a 4,000-year-old face with eyelashes still visible, hair that retained its color, preservation so perfect it seemed impossible. And now, after following the story through cities and DNA and mysterious burials and everyday objects frozen in time, we return to that face. But we see it differently now. We know who these people were. Genetically, they were ancient North Eurasians, Ice Age survivors, the last representatives of a population that vanished elsewhere 10,000 years ago. They persisted in their desert isolation, maintaining genetic separation while remaining open to the world in every other way. We know how they lived. At oasis, fed by mountain rivers, in cities like Gaochang that thrived against all odds, trading with merchants from Persia and Rome, adopting wheat farming and dairy herding and sophisticated textile techniques, making dumplings that would look familiar in any modern Chinese restaurant, wearing plaid patterns that matched textiles 4,000 miles away in Austria. We know some of what they believed, or at least what they did, burying their dead in boats despite living in a waterless desert, erecting enormous phallic poles to mark women's graves, using cannabis for spiritual purposes, painting their faces with cosmetics made from cattle hearts, wearing their cheese as jewelry, perhaps as provisions for an afterlife journey. We know how hard their lives were, breathing air filled with sand and smoke that destroyed lungs, wearing clothing mended over and over because replacement was difficult, living with parasites and disease, surviving in one of the harshest environments humans have ever tried to call home. And we know how they died, sometimes from respiratory failure, sometimes from disease, sometimes as infants tenderly buried with blue bonnets and wool in their nostrils and stones on their eyes, always carefully, always with ceremony, always acknowledged by their communities as losses that mattered. We've learned so much. DNA analysis that answered questions definitively. Cheese that revealed fermentation technology. Textiles that showed cultural connections across continents. Dumplings that demonstrated culinary continuity. Every discovery adding another piece to the puzzle. But we don't know everything. And that's important to acknowledge. We don't know why they buried people in boats. We have theories, good theories, but no certainty. That mystery remains. We don't know the exact meaning of their fertility symbolism. We can interpret, we can contextualize, but we can't know what it meant to them, what they felt, when they erected those poles. What they believed about life and death and the connection between them. We don't know their language, can't hear their voices, can't read whatever stories they told or songs they sang. The written records from Gaochang help with later periods, but the earlier Bronze Age people, their words are lost. And in a way, that's okay. Not everything needs to be explained. Some mysteries can remain mysterious. Some gaps in knowledge can stay gaps, because those unknowns remind us that we're looking at real people. Complex people. People with inner lives and thoughts and beliefs that might remain forever beyond our reach. What we can do is recognize ourselves in them. See the common humanity, the parent grieving for a 3-month-old baby, the person who loved hats enough to be buried with 10 of them, the woman whose lungs gave out from breathing bad air, the shaman who used cannabis to reach altered states, the communities that valued textiles and food and careful burial practices. These aren't alien beings. They're us, separated by time and culture and language. Yes, but united by the basic experiences of being human. Love, loss, creativity, spirituality, the struggle to survive, the desire to be remembered. The desert gave them that remembrance. Accidentally, without intention, by simply being so extreme that decay couldn't happen, by freeze-drying bodies before bacteria could work, by creating conditions that preserved faces and hair and clothing and food better than the most elaborate Egyptian mummification techniques. Nature in its harshest form was gentler with their memory than time itself. And that's the final paradox. The place that should have erased them became their greatest protector. The environment that ended their civilizations ensured they would never be truly forgotten. The desert that swallowed cities whole couldn't quite swallow the people. They remain, waiting in the sand, ready to tell their story. Today, many of them rest in museums, in Urumqi, in Beijing, in institutions around the world. Climate-controlled cases, protecting them from the very decay that the desert held at bay for thousands of years. Seen by visitors who marvel at their preservation, studied by scientists who continue to extract information. DNA, proteins, ancient bacteria, chemical signatures. Every year, new techniques reveal new details. The story isn't finished. More mummies will be discovered, more sites excavated, more analyses performed. Each finding will add nuance, complexity, understanding. But the essential wonder will remain. These people, against all odds, against the passage of 4,000 years, are still here, still visible, still present in ways that most ancient peoples could never be. When you look at that face again, that 4,000-year-old face with its visible eyelashes and preserved features, you're not looking at a relic. You're looking at a person. Someone who lived and loved and struggled and died. Someone whose community cared enough to bury them with ceremony. Someone who happened to be laid to rest in the only place on earth where that kind of preservation was possible. They couldn't have known, couldn't have imagined that their bodies would outlast their cities, that their faces would be seen by people from cultures they couldn't have conceived of, that their DNA would be sequenced by technologies that would seem like magic, that their story would be told on devices that transmit information around the world instantly. But here we are, telling that story, marveling at their survival, finding connections across impossible time spans. The desert keeps its secrets, but it also shares them slowly, patiently, one perfectly preserved body at a time. Sleep well, and perhaps dream of desert winds, of ancient cities slowly disappearing under sand, of faces that remain somehow alive despite death, of mystery solved, and mysteries still waiting, of the strange and wonderful ways that time can fold back on itself, allowing the long dead to speak to us once more. The Silk Road carried many things: silk and spices, ideas and technologies. But in the end, it also carried something more precious: the preserved memory of the people who made it possible. People who are with us still, waiting in the sand.